Hello. How are you? Happy New Year. Yes. We're going to make it happy. You guys are making it happy. Welcome to the 2016-17 Inprint Margarett Brown Reading Series. I am Rich Levy, Executive Director of Inprint, Houston's hardworking nonprofit literary arts organization, and we're glad you're here this evening. Since 1980, this series has presented more than 350 great writers from 28 countries, including winners of 60 Pulitzer Prizes, 55 National Book Awards, 8 Nobel Prizes, and more. We place a high value on the written word, and thank you for joining with us now more than ever in a celebration of thoughtfulness. Tonight, we're honored and delighted to welcome back to Houston and the Inprint Brown Reading Series, Annie Proulx, reading from and discussing her epic novel, Barkskins. Next up on March 6th, fiction writer George Saunders, who along with 5 actors from the Alley Company will give a choral reading. This is his idea. A choral reading from his long-awaited new novel, Lincoln in the Bardo. Don't miss it. Tickets go on sale on the Inprint website tomorrow at noon. And then I hope you'll join us for other great evenings. Ada Limon and Gregory Pardlow will be here in April, and Cullum Toybeen in May with a new novel. Great writers sharing great books. These tickets go quickly, so as they say in Chicago, buy early and often. You're also invited to the Inprint Book Club on Sunday, February 12th at Inprint House to discuss Juan Gabriel Vasquez's novel Reputations. All the details, plus many diverting links, are at imprinthouston.org, where you can also join the email list and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. The Inprint Brown Reading Series is presented by Inprint in association with Brazos Bookstore and the University of Houston Creative Writing Program. This series is made possible by the generous support of the Brown Foundation and named for one of its trustees, its founding trustees, Margarett Brown. The series is also underwritten by Weatherford International and the National Endowment for the Arts, which affirms that art works. We owe thanks to Houston Public Media here tonight, helping us film this, MM Properties, and Wind Park for their in-kind support. Inprint receives funding from the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance and from the Texas Commission on the Arts, and big thanks, as always, to our season ticket buyers. As I said, tonight's reading will be available as video on demand on the Inprint and Houston Public Media websites later this week. After the reading tonight, Annie will have a conversation here on stage with novelist and playwright Robert Boswell, who with his wife Antonia Nelson holds the Cullen Chair in Creative Writing at the University of Houston. Then we'll move upstairs to the Grand Foyer for a book sale and signing. Brazos Bookstore offers discounts on books by Inprint series authors, and tonight they have signed copies of Annie's books for sale. Finally, please set your cell phones on stun or silent mode. Thank you. Annie Proulx last read in Houston in this series more than 20 years ago from part of what would become her third novel, Accordion Crimes. She has since published 2 other fine novels and 3 terrific collections of Wyoming stories, plus a memoir, Bird Cloud, about her ranch in Wyoming. We're thrilled to have her back, not a moment too soon, with her 10th book. Proux's novel, Barkskins, drives its great narrative engine like the novels of Balzac through 300 years in the lives of 2 families involved in the timber industry and the destruction of our virgin forests. With her lean, fresh prose, her sharp wit, and her love of history and the natural world, the book takes you on a swift and raging ride through the unstoppable growth of a nation and a cast of characters who enter and exit without fanfare, as if you were riding a freshly hewn log downstream to the sawmill. For those of us who love a big, well-crafted story, it's hard to put down. I think Anthony Doerr identifies one of the keys to the book's power. The propulsive tension here, he writes, is generated not by wondering what will happen to each character, but by knowing that the forests will be leveled one after another. If Barkskins doesn't bear exquisite witness to our species' insatiable appetite for consumption, nothing can. Please join me in giving a rousing Houston welcome to a writer whose work feels both essential and inevitable, Annie Proulx.
Thank you, Houstonians, for coming tonight. I appreciate it very much. Before I start this, there's something I would like you to keep in mind. In 1693, the world population was roughly 600 million people. Today, it is 7,400,000,000 people. The story of Barkskins falls between these two Malthusian dates. Chapter 1, Trépanier. In twilight, they passed L'État-de-Sac, Quebec, and Trois-Rivières, and near dawn moored at a remote riverbank settlement. René Selle, stiff black hair, slanted eyes, and ancient times invading Huns had been at his people, heard someone say, "Wobik." Mosquitoes covered their hands and necks like fur. A man with yellow eyebrows pointed them at a rain-dark house. Mud, rain, biting insects, and the odor of willows made the first impression of New France. The second impression was a vast, dark forest, inimical wilderness. The newcomers, standing in the rain, waiting to be called to make their marks in a great ledger, saw the farmers clumped under a sheltering spruce. The farmers stared at them and exchanged comments. At his turn, René made not only an X, but the letter R, marred by a spatter of ink from the quill, a letter which he had learned in childhood from the old priest who said it was the beginning of René, his name, but the priest had died of winter starvation before he could teach him the succeeding letters. Yellow Eyebrows regarded the R. "Quite the learned fellow, eh?" he said. He bawled out, "Monsieur Claude Trépanier," and René's new master, a shambling, muscular man, beckoned him forward. He carried a heavy stick like a cudgel. Drops of rain caught in the wool of his knitted cap. Thick brows couldn't shadow his glaring eyes, the white so white and flashing they falsely indicated a vivacious nature. "We must wait a little," he said to René. The damp sky sagged downward. They waited. Yellow Eyebrows, the deputy whom his new master called Monsieur Bouchard, again bawled, "Monsieur Trépanier," who this time fetched a familiar, Charles Duquet, scrawny engagé from the ship, a weakling from the Paris slums who during the voyage often folded up in the corner like a broken stick. So, thought René, Monsieur Trépanier had taken 2 servants. Perhaps he was wealthy, although his sodden cloak was tattered. Monsieur Trépanier tramped up the muddy path toward a line of black mist. He did not so much walk as hurl himself along on his varied legs, one limber, one stiff. He said, "Allons-y." They plunged into the gloomy country, a dense hardwood forest broken by stands of pine. René did not dare ask what services he would be performing. After years of manly labor chopping trees in the Morvan highlands, he did not want to be a house servant. In a few hours, the sodden leaf mold gave way to pine duff. The air was intensely aromatic. Fallen needles muted their passage. The interlaced branches absorbed their panting breaths. Here grew hugeous trees of a size not seen in the old country for hundreds of years, evergreens taller than cathedrals, cloud-piercing spruce and hemlock. The monstrous deciduous trees stood distant from each other, but overhead their leaf-choked branches merged into a fabric sky, a false sky, dark and savage. Achille, his older brother, would have gaped at New France's trees. Late in the day, they passed by a slope filled with shining white trunks. These, said Monsieur Trépanier, were bouleaux blancs, and the sauvages made houses and boats from the bark. René did not believe this. The big trees made him think again of his brother Achille, le flotteur, who had spent his brief years plunging in and out of the cold Yonne, guiding logs down the river. He had been powerful, immune to the water's chill, had worked until a log with a broken limb, sharpened and polished to a spear by the friction of its travels, had pierced his bladder, carrying him along like a gobbet of meat on a spit. René now wore his brother's underwear and wool trousers and his short coat. He wore Achille's shoes, though a barefoot life had given him calloused feet, tough as cow hoofs, hardened against French cold. In this new world, he would learn the cold was of a different order. The engagés, dizzy with the narcotic effect of deep forest, stumbled on sprawling spruce roots. Bibites assailed them, minuscule no-see-ums like heated needles, black flies with a painless bite that dispersed slow toxins, swarms of mosquitoes in such millions that their shrill keening was the sound of the woods. At a bog, Monsieur Trépanier told them to smear mud over their exposed skin, especially behind the ears and on the crown of the head. The insects crept through the hair and stabbed the scalp. That, said Monsieur Trépanier, was why he wore a toque in this damnable country. René thought an iron helmet would be a better choice. Monsieur Trépanier said the sauvages made a protective salve from spruce needle oil and animal fat, but he had none. Mud would do. They walked on through the dim woods, climbing over mossy humps, passing under branches drooping like dark funeral swags. The engagés' legs, weakened by long ocean voyage, cramped with fatigue. How big is this forest? Asked Duquet in his whinging treble voice. He was scarcely larger than a child. Oh, it's the forest of the world. It's infinite. It twists around as a snake swallows its own tail. It has no end, no beginning. No one has ever seen its farthest dimension. Monsieur Trépanier stopped. With his stick, he smashed out dry spruce twigs at the base of a tree. From beneath his cloak, he took a fire bundle and made a small blaze, and they crouched around it, stretching out their purple hands. He unfolded a cloth wrapping, revealing a piece of moose meat, cut pieces for each of them. Famished, René, who had only hoped for bread, bit and tore at the meat. The gray mosquitoes hummed at his ears. Duquet looked out from puffed slits, and unable to chew, he sucked the meat. Beneath Monsieur Trépanier's generosity, they sensed contempt. They walked on through a chaos of deadfalls, victims of some great windstorm. Monsieur Trépanier following no discernible path, but frequently looking upward. René saw he was following cut marks on certain trees, marks 10 feet above the ground. Later, he learned someone had blazed the trees in winter, standing high above the earth in snowshoes like a kind of weightless wizard. The forest had many edges, like a lace altarpiece. Its moody darkness eased in the clearings. Unknown plants and curious blossoms caught their eyes, funereal spruce and hemlock, the bright new growth puffs at the tips of the pine branches, silvery tossing willow, the mint green of new birch, a place where even the sunlight was green. As they approached one opening, they heard an irregular clacking sound like sticks. Gray bones tied in a tree, stirred by the wind. Monsieur Trépanier said that the sauvages often hung up the bones of a killed animal after thanking its spirit. He led them around beaver ponds protected by an almost impenetrable alder queech, warning that the narrow pathways were moose runs. They passed through wet country, hollows brimmed with tea-colored rainwater. The quaking sphagnum, punctuated with pitcher plants, sucked at every step. The young men had never imagined country so wild and wet, so thickly wooded. When an alder branch tore at Duquet's jacket, he swore in a low voice. Monsieur Trépanier heard him and said he must never curse a tree, especially the alder, which had medicinal powers. They drank at streams, crossed yellow, shallow riffles curved like Damascene scimitar blades. Oh, how much longer, muttered Duquet, one hand to the side of his face. They came again to open forest where it was easy to stride under the trees. Sauvages burned away the underbrush, said their new master in a disparaging tone. In late afternoon, Monsieur Trépanier cried, "Porc pique!" and suddenly hurled his walking stick. It whirled once and struck the porcupine a blow on the nose. The animal pitched down like a falling star, trailed by blood drops. Monsieur Trépanier built a big fire, and when the flames subsided, its purple rods suspended the flames subsided into purple rods, suspended the gutted animal over the coals. The burning quills stank. But when he took the carcass off the fire, beneath the blackened crust, the meat was good. From his bottomless pockets, Monsieur Trépanier drew a bag of salt and gave each of them a pinch. The leftover meat he wrapped in a greasy cloth. The master built up the fire again, rolled into his cloak, lay down under a tree, closed his fiery eyes, and slept. René's legs cramped, the cold, the pines hissing in the wind, wheedling mosquitoes and owl cries kept him awake. He spoke softly to Charles Duquet, who did not answer, and then he was silent. In the night, something half wakened him. Morning began with fire. Though it was late spring, it was colder than cold France. Light crawled into the gloom. Monsieur Trépanier, gnawing on leftover meat, kicked Duquet and bellowed, "Levez-vous!" René was up before Monsieur Trépanier could kick him. He looked at the meat in Monsieur Trépanier's hand. The man tore off a piece and threw it to him, tore another and threw it to Duquet as one might throw scraps to a dog, then headed out with his tireless lurching gait, following the cuts high on the trees. The new servant saw only darkness except to their rear, where the abandoned fire winked beguilingly. The day was cold but dry. Monsieur Trépanier racked along a dim trail, but by noon the rain returned. They were stuporous with fatigue when they reached snarling water, a black river, yet transparent as dark chert. On the far side, they saw a clearing filled with stacks of cordwood and the omnipresent forest pressing in. Smoke rose from a hidden chimney. They could not see the house, only mountains of wood and outbuildings. Monsieur Trépanier shouted. A woman in a moose-skin tunic painted with curling designs came around the end of the nearest wood pile and called out, "Quick!" and then turned away. René Selle and Charles Duquet exchanged stares. An Indian woman, une sauvage. They followed Monsieur Trépanier into the frigid river. René slipped on a round river rock and half fell, thinking of Achille of the icy Yonne. Fish veered around them, shot past, so many fish, the river seemed made of hard muscle. On the muddy shore, they passed a fenced garden plot of weeds. Monsieur Trépanier began to sing, Marie, Marie, Dame Jolie. The Anjaguets kept silent. Duquet's mouth was pinched as if the air burned, his eyes swollen, almost shut. Beyond the wood piles, they saw Monsieur Trépanier's house, their first sight of the timber pièce-sur-pièce style, the steep-hipped roof, the shape of the bell-cast eaves, familiar from France. But every part was wood, except for 3 small windows set with expensive French glass. Against the trees, they saw a wigwam, which they learned the next day was a Sauvage woman's bark house, where she retreated with her children at night. Monsieur Trépanier took them to his storehouse. The interior stank of rotting potatoes, marsh hay, and cow shit. One end was partitioned off, and behind it they heard the breathing of a beast. They saw a black fire pit, a forge. Monsieur Trépanier, enamored of his own voice, continued to sing, made a fire in the pit, and left them. Outside, his voice receded. Ah, bon jardin, franc cavalier. The rain began again. René and Duquet sat in darkness except for the light of the dying fire. There were no windows in the building, and when Duquet opened the door to let in light, clouds of savage midges and mosquitoes rushed them. They sat in the near dark. Duquet spoke. He said he was suffering from toothache and would run away at his first chance and return to France. René was silent. After a time, the door opened. The Sauvage woman and 2 children came in, their arms full. The woman said, bien, bien, and gave each of them a beaver robe. She pointed to herself and said, Mali, for like most Micmacs, she found it difficult to pronounce the letter R. René said his name, and she repeated it, René. The larger child set down a wooden bowl of hot cornmeal. They disappeared. René and Duquet scooped the mush out of the bowl with their fingers. They wrapped themselves in the robes and slept. It was not light when Monsieur Trépanier wrenched open the door and shouted in a hard voice, Allons-y! Behind the partition came the sounds of jets of milk hitting the bottom of a wooden bucket. He tossed them pieces of smoked sturgeon and took his steel-bladed axe from the wall, gave them each a short, hafted, dulled axe. René's had a great chip missing from the cutting edge. In the dripping dawn, Trépanier led them past a maize garden and into a small clearing. He swung his arm in an arc and in an ironic voice called the cramped space his big clearing, le grand défrichement, and then began to chop at a tree with skillful strokes. He commanded them to do the same. He said today they would cut logs to build their quarters, an enlargement of his Domus, so that they might vacate his storehouse as quickly as possible. René swung the short-handled trade tool, felt the jolt of the tree's resistance, swung again, embarking on his life's work of clearing the forest of New France. Duquet nibbled at a tree with his hatchet, a yellow discharge leaking from his bitten eyes. They limbed the fallen trees, rolled and dragged them to the edge of the clearing. The branches went aside to be chopped into cordwood. The axe was dull. In the time it took René to fell one smallish tree, the master brought down 3 larger and was at work on a 4th. There must be a way to sharpen an axe with a quarter of the cutting edge gone, he thought. He would refresh sharpness. With doubts, he chose a river cobble and began to grind the edge with circular motions. There was no visible progress, and he soon began chopping again. Monsieur Trépanier picked up the useless cobble and threw it into the forest, took the axe from René and flourished it. To sharpen, he said, we use sandstone. He pantomimed the sharpening. René wanted to ask where Monsieur Trépanier kept his sharpening stones, but the man's glaring expression kept him quiet. Monsieur Trépanier twisted his lips at Duquet's whittle marks. He regarded Duquet's lopsided face. Open your mouth, he said, tapped the rotten tooth with the blade of his knife, and muttered that he would pull it at the end of the day. Duquet made a negative sound. At the height of the sun, the Sauvage woman brought a pot of steaming maize. René had rarely eaten food at midday. With the wood chip, Monsieur Trépanier scooped out a glob. In the center of the maize melted a creamy substance. René took some on his wood chip, was overcome by the richness. Oh, he said, and took more. Monsieur Trépanier said tersely that it was cacamos, moose bone marrow. Duquet barely ate even this and leaned against a tree, breathing noisily. At twilight, they left the clearing. Monsieur Trépanier clattered through his smithy tools until he found a pair of ironmonger's pliers. Duquet sat open mouth on a stump. Monsieur Trépanier seized the tooth with the tool and wrenched. He dropped the yellow fang on the ground. Duquet spat blood and pus, his lower lip split from the weight of the pliers. Allons-y, said Monsieur Trépanier, moving toward his house. René saw him pick up Duquet's tooth and put it in his pocket. The men entered the single room, and their masculine stench blended into the human funk of the North Woods. The pockmarked Marie noticed René's nostrils flare at the smell of the house and threw an aromatic juniper branch on the fire. In the hubbub of brats, they heard some names, Alphège, Théotiste, Jean-Baptiste, but all they looked the same. They all looked the same, and so like their Mi'kmaq mother that René forgot their names immediately. Marie spoke a patois mixed Mi'kmaq and terse French with a few Portuguese phrases in a curious rhythm. The children all had French names. She brought them a pot of unsalted stewed goose cooked with wild onions and herbs. The meat fell off the bone, though Duquet could manage only a little of the broth. A small dish of coarse salt stood in front of Trépanier, and he pinched it up with thumb and 2 fingers. Marie does not cook with sel. The Mi'kmaq say it spoils the food. So, always carry your own sel, René sel, unless you can put your thumb in the victuals and season them with your name. Then came a plate of hot corn cakes. Monsieur Trépanier poured an amber syrup on his cakes, and René did the same. The syrup was sweet and smoky, better than honey, and he could not believe it came from a tree, as the master said. Duquet, exhausted by his ordeal, bent his head. Marie went to her cupboard and stirred something. She brought it to Duquet. Monsieur Trépanier said perhaps it was a potion made from green alder catkins, the very alders Duquet had cursed, so then the medicine would not work for him. Marie said, willow leaf, willow bark, good medicine. Marie made. And Duquet swallowed it and slept that night. Day after day, the chopping continued, and their hands swelled, blistered, hardened. The rhythm of chopping seized them, despite the dull axes. Monsieur Trépanier watched René work. Oh, you've held an axe before. You have a woodman's skill. René told him about the Morvan forest where he and Achille had cut trees, but already that life was unmoored and slipping sideways out of memory. Ah, said Monsieur Trépanier. The next morning he took the wretched axes from them and went off, leaving them alone. So, said René to Duquet, what is Monsieur Trépanier? Is he a rich man or not? Duquet produced a hard laugh. Oh, I thought that between you and Monsieur Trépanier, all the knowledge of the world was conquered. Do you not know that he is the seigneur and we the censitaire, what some call habitant? He's a seigneur, but he wants to be a nobleman in this new country. He apportions us land, and for 3 years we pay him with our labor and certain products such as radishes or turnips from the land he allows us to use. What land? Fine question. Until now we have been working, but there has been no talk of land. Monsieur Trépanier is full of malignant cunning. The king could take the seigneurie from him if he knew. Did you not really understand the paper you signed? It was clearly explained in France. I thought it concerned only a period of servitude. I did not understand about the land. Does that mean we are to be farmers? Landowners? Plowmen and settlers, not landowners, but land users, opening the forest, growing turnips. If people in France believed they could own land here outright, they would rush in by the thousands. I, for one, do not wish to be a peasant. I don't know why you came here, but I came to do something. The money is in the fur trade. I'm no farmer, I'm a woodsman, but I would like very much to have my own land. And I would like to know why he took my tooth. I saw him. And I, too, saw this. There's something evil there. This man has a dark vein in his heart. Monsieur Trépanier returned a few hours later with iron axes for them, the familiar straight-hafted latin René had known all his life. They were new and the steel cutting edges were sharp. He had brought good whetstones as well. Now René felt the power in this axe, its greedy hunger to bite through all that stood in its way, sap spurting, firing out white chips like china shards. With a pointed stone, he marked the haft with his initial, R. As he cut, the wildness of the world receded, the vast invisible web of filaments that connected human life to animals, trees to flesh, and bones to grass shivered as each tree fell, and one by one the web strands snapped. After weeks of chopping, limbing, and bark peeling, of dragging logs to Monsieur Trépanier's clearing with his 2 oxen, cutting, notching, and mortising the logs as the master directed, lifting them into place, chinking the gaps with river mud, the new building was nearly finished. We should be building our own houses on our assigned lands, not constructing a shared lodging next to his ménage, Duquet said, his inflamed eyes winking. Still they cut trees, piling them in heaps to dry and setting older piles alight. The air was in constant smoke, the smell of New France. The stumpy ground was gouged by oxen's cloven hoofs, as though a hallroom of devils had clogged in the mud. The trees fell, their shadows replaced by scalding light. The mosses and ferns below them withered. Why, asked René, why do you not sell these fine trees to France for shipmasts? Monsieur Trépanier laughed unpleasantly. He loathed René's foolish questions. Because the idiots prefer Baltic timber. They have no idea what's here. They are inflexible. They neglect the riches of New France, except for furs. He slapped his leg. Even 100 years ago, des Champlain, who discovered New France, begged them to take advantage of the fine timber, the fish and rich furs, leather and 100 other valuable things. But did they listen to him? No. Very much no. They let those precious resources waste, except for furs. And there were others with good ideas, but the gentlemen in France were not interested. And some of those men with ideas went to the English, and the seeds they planted there will bear bloody fruit. The English send thousands to their colonies, but France cannot be bothered. As spring advanced, moist and buggy, each tree sending up a fresh fountain of oxygen, Duquet's face swelled with another abscess. Monsieur Trépanier extracted the new dental offense and said commandingly that now he would pull them all, and Duquet would waste no more time with toothaches. He lunged with the blacksmith's pliers, but Duquet dodged away, shook his head violently, spattering blood, and said something in a low voice. Monsieur Trépanier, putting the second tooth in his pocket, spun around and said in a silky gentleman's voice, "I'll have your skull." Duquet leaned a little forward but did not speak. Some days later, Duquet, still carrying his axe, made an excuse to relieve his bowels and walked into the forest. While he was out of earshot, René asked Monsieur Trépanier if he was their seigneur. "And what if I am?" "Then, sir, are we, Duquet and I, to have some land to work?" Duquet wishes to know. "Oh, in time that will occur, but not until 3 years have passed, not until the Domus is finished, not until my brothers are here, and certainly not until the ground is cleared for a new maize plot, which is our immediate task. So continue. The land comes at the end of your service." And he drove his axe into a spruce. Duquet was gone for a long time. Hours passed. Monsieur Trépanier laughed. He said Duquet must be looking for his land. With vindictive relish, he described the terrors of being lost in the forest, of drowning in the icy river, being pulled down by wolves, trampled by moose, or snapped in half by creatures with steaming teeth. He named the furious Mi'kmaq spirits of the forest: Chepitchkam, hairy Kukwes, frost giant Chenoo, and unseen creatures who felled trees with their jaws. René's hair bristled, and he thought Monsieur Trépanier had fallen too deeply into the world of the savages. The next day, they heard a quavering voice in the distant trees. Monsieur Trépanier, who had been limping, snapped upright, listened, and said it was not one of the Micmac spirits, but one that had followed the settlers from France, the loup-garou, known to haunt forests. René, who had heard stories of this devil in wolf shape all his life, but had never seen one, thought it was Duquet beseeching them. When he made to call back, Monsieur Trépanier told him to shut his mouth unless he wanted to bring the loup-garou closer. They heard it wailing and calling something that sounded like "Mama." Monsieur Trépanier said that to call for its mother like a lost child was a well-known trick of the loup-garou, and that they would work no more that day, lest the sound of the chopping lead the beast to them. "Vite!" Monsieur Trépanier shouted, and they ran back to the house. With Duquet gone, "Eaten by the loup-garou," said Monsieur Trépanier with lip-smacking noises, the seigneur became talkative, but told differing versions of his history while he chopped, most of his words lost under the blows of the axe. He had a skilled eye that could see where small trees stood more or less in a row, and these he would notch and then fell the great tree at the end, which obligingly took down all the small trees. He said his people came from the Pyrenees, but another time he placed them in the north, in Lille, nor did he neglect Paris as his source. He described his hatred of villages and their lying, spying, churchy inhabitants. He despised the Jesuits. Monsieur Trépanier said he, his brothers, and their uncle Jean came to New France to enter the fur trade, though he himself had better reasons. "Our people in earlier times were badly treated in France. The popish demon church called us heretics and tortured us. They believed they had conquered us. They were wrong. We have held to our beliefs, hand, head, heart, and body in secret for centuries. And here in New France, we will grow strong again." He extolled the new land, said it would surpass old France in richness and power. "A new world that will become greater than cold-hearted old France with its frozen ideas. Someday New France will extend all the way to Florida, all the way to the great river in the west." Frontenac saw this. René thought of it and agreed. New France was a prize if England kept away, but he did not often think of such things. He saw himself as a dust mote in the wind of life, going where the drafts of that great force carried him. What, asked Monsieur Trépanier, is the most important thing, after God, of course? René wanted to say land. He wanted to say seeds. He wanted to say stolen teeth. He didn't say anything. Blood, said Monsieur Trépanier. Your family, your blood people. They are all dead, said René, but Monsieur Trépanier ignored him and continued his history. He and his brothers, he said, went up the mysterious Saguenay River to barter with the Hurons for furs and later with Ottawa, building up trust, but we avoided the Iroquois, who loved the English and who from childhood practiced testing themselves against horrible tortures. They enjoy inflicting pain on others. The voyageur's life is a good life for my brothers who still ply the rivers. For me, it is a very disagreeable way. Now, he said, the Iroquois are less terrible than in former times, but all Indians were mad for copper kettles. The bigger the better, so large they could not be easily moved, and the possession of a kettle changed their wandering ways. Once they had that copper or iron kettle, no longer did they roam the forests and rivers so vigorously. Villages grew up around the kettles. All very well, but someone had to carry those monstrous vessels to them. Someone had to toil and hold them up the dangerous portage routes. He pointed silently at his breast. This was below my station in life, and he smote his tree. The fur trade moved north and west, he said to the tree as he told of his disenchantment. The portages, 6-8 miles of rocks with 2 fur packs the weight of a cow, then back to the canoe, more packs or one of the cursed kettles, and finally the canoe. You would not believe the enormous load some of these men carried. One is said to have carried 500 weight each trip from early morning until darkness. Carrying one of the detested kettles, said Trépanier, his right knee gave way. The injury plagued him still. However, the fur company, with the rights the king assigned them, made me a seigneur and charged me to gather habitants and populate New France. This is the beginning of a great new city in the wilderness. René asked a question that had bothered him since the first trek through the woods. Why do we cut the forest when there are so many fine clearings? Why wouldn't a man build his house in a clearing, one of those meadows that we passed when we walked here? Would that not be easier? But Monsieur Trépanier was scandalized. Easier? Yes, easier, but we are here to clear the forest, to subdue this evil wilderness. He was silent for a minute, thinking, and then started in again. Moreover, here in New France, there's a special way of apportioning property. Strips of land that run from the river to the forest give each settler fertile farm soil, high ground safe from floods, forest trees for timber, fuel, and mushrooms. It is an equitable arrangement not possible with clearings taken up willy-nilly, bon gré, mal gré. René hoped this was the end of the lecture, but the man went on. Men must change this land in order to live in it. In olden times, men lived like beasts, and in those ancient days, men had claws and long teeth, nor could they speak, but only growled. And he made a sound to show how they growled. René, chopping trees, felt not the act, but the pure motion, the raised axe, the gathering tension in arms and shoulders, buttocks and thighs, the hips pivoting, knees loose and flexed, and then the swing downward, as abstract as the shadow of a stone, a kind of forest dance. He had bound a rock to the pole with the babiche to counterbalance the heavy bit. It increased the accuracy of each stroke. Monsieur Trépanier launched into a droning sermon on the necessity, the duty of removing the trees, of opening land, not just for oneself, but for posterity, for what this place would become. Someday, Monsieur Trépanier said, pointing into the gloom, someday men will grow cabbages here. To be a man is to clear the forest. I don't see the trees, he said. I see the cabbages. I see the vineyards. Monsieur Trépanier said his uncle, Jean Trépanier, dit chamailleur for his disputatious nature, Chama for short, would take Duquet's place. He was old but strong, stronger than Duquet. He would come soon. Monsieur Trépanier's brothers would also come, eventually. And he said the time for felling trees was now over. The bébites were at their worst, the wet heat dangerous, the trees too full of sap. Indeed, the hellish swarms of biting insects were with them day and night. Winter is the correct time to cut the forest. Today is the time for removing stumps and burning. It was also the time, he added, for René to begin to fulfill his other duties. For 3 days a week, your labor is mine. As part of your work, said Monsieur Trépanier, you are to supply my table with fish. The more immediate work involved preparing the gardens for Marie. The oxen, Rat and Reine, pulled Monsieur Trépanier's old plow sullenly, a savage fly with a green head battened on their blood. Monsieur Trépanier smeared the animals with river clay, which hardened into dusty clots, but could do nothing about the clustering gnats. But Marie, the Indian woman, steeped tamarack bark in spring water, and twice daily sluiced their burning eyes. In the long afternoons, with many sighs, she planted the despised garden. One day that summer, she sent her 2 young sons to a place called Odenak, where remnants of her people had fled. Goose catch, learn them. Many traps, learn. Good men's there, hunting. Here, only garden, cut tree, learn. Monsieur Trépanier said acidly that what they would learn in Odenak would be rebellion against the settlers and warfare. Mindful of his fishing duties, René went to the river. Monsieur Trépanier had given him a knife, fish hooks, a waxed linen line, and a large basket for the fish. In the river, fish were large and angry, and several times the linen line parted and he lost a precious hook. But Marie was scornful. Small fish, she said. Good fishermen, not Lene. My people make weirs, catch many, big many. To divert her irritation, he pointed at a stinging nettle in the garden. We have those in France, he said. Yes, bad plant grow where step white man people. Those who is it coming? Buenos. Marie asked him to leave the fish intact. She would clean them herself. She buried the entrails in the garden, and when René asked her if that was the Indian way, she gave him a look and said it was a common practice for all fools who grew gardens instead of gathering the riches of the country. Eels, she said, eels catch. Eels liking us. We river people. She wove 3 eel traps for him and gave him fish scraps for bait, went with him to the river and showed him likely places to try. Almost every day thereafter, he brought her fat eels. She said the Micmac had many ways to catch eels and that the traps were best for him. When her sons came back from the Abenaki village of Odenak, they could show him other ways. In early July, the pine trees loosed billows of pollen, yellow plumes like citrine, smoke drifting through the forest, mixing with the smoke from burning trees. One morning, an old man, his back bent beneath a bundle, his glaring eyes roving left and right, came ricketing out of the pollen clouds from the west trail, which led, as far as René knew, to the end of the world. Above the little mouth stretched a gray mustache like a bit of sheep's wool caught on a twig. The eyes were like Monsieur Trépanier's eyes, black and white and rolling. Margarett looked at René, who was preparing to go fishing, and started up at once. "Salut, you bastard! Why are you not working?" "I am. It is part of my duty to supply the house with fish for the table." "What? With a string and a hook?" "You must use a net. Have the woman make a net." "Or a basket trap. Or you must use a spear. Those are the best ways." "For me, the line and hook are best." "Oh, stupid and obstinate." "Hey, stupide, obstiné." "I know what is best, and you do not." "It's good I came. I could see you need correction. My nephew is too easy." René continued stubbornly with his hooks and twisted linen line, but he thought about nets. A net might be better, for the fish were so thick in the river he might get several large ones at the same time. As for Marie's insufferable speechifying on the ways the Micmac built different kinds of weirs, how they hunted a sturgeon at night with blazing torches and spears, he ignored all she said. He did use the eel trap she had made, excusing himself on the ground that eels were not fish. Searching for land to claim when his servitude ended, he discovered Monsieur Trépagny's secret. He had walked far upstream. Recent rains had enlarged the river to a bounding roar over its thousands of rocks. He thought it might be best to choose land not too close to the river, but something with a spring or modest stream. He made his way through an old deadfall where in between the fallen trees millions of saplings grew as close together as broom straws. Twice he heard a great crashing and saw a swipe of black fur disappear into the underbrush. In early afternoon, he came onto a wide but faint trail tending east-west and wondered if it might connect to Monsieur Trépagny's clearing to the east. Instead, with the afternoon before him, he turned west. He saw traces of old ruts that could only have been made by a cart. It was not an Indian trail. Now he was curious. In mid-afternoon, the trail divided. He followed the wagon ruts. The way became markedly different in character than the usual forest path. Trees had been carefully cleared to create the effect of an allée, the ground thinly spread with thousands of broken white shells. He saw this allée ran straight, a dark tunnel of trees with a pointed cone of light at the end. He had seen these passageways in France, leading to the grand houses of nobles, although he had never ventured into one. And here, in the forest of New France, was the blackest, harshest allée of the world. The trees like cruel iron brushes, white shells cracked by deer hooves. The end of the allée seemed filled with light, a void at the limit of the tilting earth. A massive pale thing loomed up, a whitewashed stone house, almost a chateau that might have been carried on the sea winds from France and dropped in place. René knew that this was Monsieur Trépagny's Domus, the center of his secret world. There were 3 huge chimneys. The windows were of glass, the roof of fine blue slate, and the slate walkway curved around the building, leading to a fenced enclosure. The fence was tall, formed of ornate metal rods. Everything except the stone had come from France. He knew it. It must have cost a fortune, 2 fortunes, a king's ransom. It was the proof of the seigneur's madness, his mind clotted with old heretic ideas of class and Domus, himself the king of an imaginary world. Disturbed, René cut back to the main trail and followed it east. Darkness was already setting in. Night came quickly in the forest, even in the long days. As he had guessed, the trail ended in Monsieur Trépagny's clearing. He went straight to the cabin he now shared with Chama, who was rolled up in Duquette's old beaver roll, snoring and mumbling. Thank you.
Thanks for that. That was great. And welcome to Houston. I wanted to start with a question. All the other questions will be very quick, but this one takes a little bit of time to ask. My daughter, who's in her 20s, is studying to be an animal communicator. And she's also working, part of her study is to, I don't know quite how to put it, but become closer to trees, to try not exactly to communicate with them, but to understand them. I don't know what it is. And I don't really know how much of her study that I'm on board with. But I believe I take her seriously, and I think she's serious about it. And I know talking to her has changed my relationship with animals. This is a long introduction, I warned you. So, in reading Barkskins, I first noticed the epigraph from Lynn Townsend White. Pardon?
Lynn Thorndike Jr.
And I'm just going to read, I'm not going to read all of it, just the last line here. By destroying pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects. So that got me thinking, and late in the book, there is this amazing, just for me, it was just a stunning moment when Tom Pollan has come back from Afghanistan. He's suicidal, he's not well, and he winds up working in a forest. And I'm just going to read a couple of lines from that. It says, "A thought unbidden came that one of his lost friends was inside that young tree. The burn of anxious grief for that fallen friend began to soften. The work crew had fired the built-up fuel load around the old larches, and the next year's seedlings surged up in their thousands. He went on to different forests, and in each of the young trees he saw the brothers he had lost. The more seedlings he planted, the more of them he resurrected." So what it seems to me, one of the ambitions of this novel is to change the reader's relationship with the natural world in general and with trees in particular. If that sounds crazy, you can say so. Most of the people out there would agree with you, I think.
I doubt that. This is a very interesting and unusual and welcome point that you bring up. I was influenced and remain influenced, and hope that at least some of the people here tonight will look up the books by a woman named Diana Beresford Kroger. She's written 2 books. One is called Arboretum Borealis, and the other Arboretum Americana. She is a student of forests. She's Canadian, and she is something of a mystic, but her thing in life is to understand and search out the healing power of forests. And the Japanese take forest baths whenever they can, just walking through the terpene, perfumed forests of the pine mountain woods. And Diana has been there many times, part of her study. There's a Canadian film which is not released just yet called The Call of the Forests, which is about Diana's work with the woods. And this is worth looking into for anybody who wants to know more about the role that forests can play and have played in human lives and why they are so important to us. That's sort of the answer that I can give to the question I did not expect. But maybe you didn't expect that answer either.
Well, it just seems to me that literary work is always, in some sense, out to affect the reader, to change the reader. And this seems to have that a rather remarkable ambition. And that, I have to say, I found that passage near the end of the book so moving, so powerful, and so daring. I just loved it.
Oh, I'm very glad to hear that.
Okay. All right, now we're going to ask some normal questions. This is another one I really wanted to ask you. I read in an interview that you said that when you're working on a short story, you have to have some sense of the ending, but when you're working on a novel, that you actually write the ending first. And, well, that kind of blew my mind. So I thought I would just ask, how do you do that? How does that work?
It works because I know where I'm going to be starting from and where I want to end up. I don't actually write the ending as much as keep it in mind, because the book has its own momentum and passages and words and threads and so forth that have to be there at the end. But I know where it's going to go. It's practically the same thing as far as I'm concerned as writing the ending. I know the ending before I know the beginning. I know what I want to write about. The ending is what the book's about. And the beginning is just a beginning.
When you were talking to students today, you said you usually start with history and place and go from there, and you rarely start with character. That too seems to me like a very different kind of approach from most writers.
Really? Oh. Well, I haven't talked to as many writers as you have, so I'm woefully ignorant of how other people write. I think you have to find your own way. But yes, because I'm interested in history, I was trained in history, not writing, intensely interested in place and in social change and in the way people think and manage things at different periods. I do spend a great deal of time before I start writing anything on the place I'm writing about, how people make their livings, and it's always rural places. What grows there, what plants there are there, what kind of wind, what weather, what climate, what geological history lies underneath it all, what the soil is like, what storms are like, what beautiful fine days are like. This kind of thing is what I love doing. The background, getting an idea and a sense of it. And once I have a fair sense of what this particular place is, whether it's Newfoundland or Wyoming high country or wherever, then the characters are there almost as though they'd been hiding behind the door. I don't start with the characters. I don't look for them. I don't seek them. They just appear once I have the background, once I understand the place, the characters are just there.
Well, it's fascinating because your characters are so memorable, and that it's just really interesting to me that they spring up out of place.
Well, everything springs from place, or so I believe.
Yeah, you have a point. Another thing I read was that you said you feel the short story is a superior form to the novel and more difficult. And I think that's probably the opposite of what most people think. Maybe not most writers, but what most people
publishers.
think. Yeah. Could you talk about the short story form some? I know you did it some this afternoon.
I like short stories very much, and I do think that they are more difficult because they demand so much from the writer. Not only the amount of research and work that you would put into a novel, but a succinctness, an intensity, a collapsing of intent that's beguiling. Working on a short story, writing one falls into that world, and it's difficult to even take a break and eat and do the normal things that need to be done, housework and garden work and so forth. The story calls to you constantly, and the pieces of it intrude into everything you think and do. It's there with you until it's finished, and when it's finished, then you can kiss it goodbye. But while working on it, it is realer than one's own life, for me anyway. So I live constantly lurching from one imagined world to another.
That's not a bad way to live.
No, it isn't.
Sounds good. Are there particular short stories that you go back to, or that you, just that you especially love?
I have never reread anything that I've written, so I don't go back ever.
I meant not necessarily your work, but short stories that you find. I don't know. There's some stories that I read and reread. And,
Oh, yeah. Catherine Ann Porter's Noon Wine, which I read when I was about 15, and which just knocked me on my ass. That is a story. And up until that point, I had just, I'd read omnivorously, but I read for plot, I read for humor. I didn't know that a short story could have that kind of power. I'd never met it before on a page, and it was a great one to begin with, and it was a turning point, I think, in my life. That story was fantastic, is fantastic. Yes, I go back to that.
Yeah, that is an amazing story, and I can see there's something maybe about the tone of that I can see. It's been an influence in your work, perhaps, too.
Yes.
She's a great writer.
Yes.
One of the things that I love about your work, it's kind of hard to talk about, but I love the sentences. And I wanted to read a few of them and maybe just see if you can talk about how they come to be so beautifully constructed and taught and just wonderful. These sentences are from Barkskins. It says, "Autumn lurched clumsily out of the equinox, black ice one day, sunlight polishing tree branches the next. A few straggler tourists were still underfoot, as irritating as gravel." I love that. And then there's one from a short story that I went and reread last night. It's a short story I recommend to all of you called Tits Up in a Ditch. The story is as good as the title. And this is the second sentence. This is all one sentence. "People said that Shayna Lister, with aquamarine eyes and curls the shining maroon of water birch bark, had won all the kitty beauty contests and then had become the high school slut, knocked up when she was 15 and cutting out the day after Dakota was born, slinking and wincing, still in her hospital Johnny, down the back stairs of Mercy Maternity to the street where one of her greasy pals picked her up and headed west for Los Angeles. Don't you love that? Now, maybe it's impossible to talk about, but you must work on these. I hope.
Right. I do. I spend a lot of time on single sentences. I'm not talking about minutes or hours, but days sometimes. And rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, and we'll go back to something. I'll do 40, 50 more versions. The thing about making a sentence that I can live with is to take out all of the extraneous words, all of the words that are not quite the right word. Many writers use words that are almost there, but not quite. But if you're really hard on yourself and pull out the ones that don't quite get the feeling you want, and spend the time of looking for the precise word, it's there somewhere. There's the wonderful word in German that I don't remember at the moment. I only remember it means when you meet somebody, you want to slap them in the face. It's a certain face that someone has. You immediately.
She looked at me. I don't.
And it's one word. It's one German word, but what a great word. So there is a right word. If you have a long, wandering sentence, the best thing you can do is get at it with the scissors and be your own censor. Cut it down, trim it until it can stand, even if it's a long sentence like that one was. In that sentence was one young girl's whole life squinted down into a sentence so I could get to the beginning of the story. But it needed that backstory of the mother. So it's just one of those things you have to do.
It's beautiful. Your work is beautiful, and I want to thank you again for coming to Houston. Let's give it up for Annie Proulx.
Thanks.